Alright, let's talk about one of the most fascinating and complicated figures of English Romanticism, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He was born in Devonshire, the youngest of 13 children, and even as a child he was thoughtful and imaginative. His father died when he was just 9, and a year later he won a place at Christ's Hospital. That's important because it's often asked in exam. One of his schoolmates, there was none other than Charles Lamb. Yes, that Charles Lamb, which is another exam favorite. Coleridge went on to Cambridge in 1791, where he got caught up in the revolutionary ideas sweeping Europe. But restless as he was, he abandoned his studies, enlisted in the army, the Light Dragoons, and unsurprisingly, that didn't last long. After a few months, he returned to Cambridge and met Robert Southey. The two planned something wildly idealistic: to start a utopian republic in America, which they called pantisocracy. It never happened, but Coleridge did marry Southey's wife's sister, so their friendship left a mark. He gave lectures, wrote poetry, and even started a short-lived newspaper called The Watchman, and yes, that's been asked in exam too. In 1797, everything changed when he met William Wordsworth. Their friendship led to Lyrical Ballads, the cornerstone of English romantic poetry. Coleridge lived for a time in the Lake District, remember that for exam, and later became fascinated by German philosophy. But his life was far from steady. He struggled with depression, marital unhappiness, and most tragically with opium addiction. By 1816, he moved into the house of a kind physician, Mr. Gilman, at Highgate. It was part home, part refuge. There he began to recover gradually, and though his health never fully returned, his conversation and intellect were said to be dazzling. Friends would visit just to hear him talk. Now, let's talk poetry, because Coleridge's genius, though brief, burned bright. His creative peak came in just 2 years, 1797 and 98. His first book, Poems on Various Subjects, appeared in 1797, but his real glory lies in the poems written with or around Lyrical Ballads. That collection contains 4 of his poems, with The Rime of the Ancient Mariner as the masterpiece, and that's been directly asked in exam. The story for The Ancient Mariner was born while Coleridge and Wordsworth were walking on the Quantock Hills talking about a cursed sailor and a ghostly ship. The poem's imagery, the voyage, the albatross, the still sea, the storm unfolds like a series of dissolving dreams. Its style and imagination remain unmatched in English poetry. In the same miraculous year, Coleridge also wrote Christabel and Kubla Khan, both unfinished, and that's an exam detail. Christabel tells a gothic, almost vampire-like tale written in an enchanting octosyllabic meter that influenced later poets. Kubla Khan, on the other hand, came to him in an opium dream. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree. Those opening lines have been asked in exam. He woke up, began writing, but was interrupted by what he called a person from Porlock, and the poem was never finished. Even so, it's one of the most haunting, dreamlike poems in English. Around the same time, he wrote Frost at Midnight, Love, and Ode to France. All in 1797, each of these has shown up in exam lists. Later came Dejection, an ode in 1802, where he laments the loss of his creative energy, that shaping spirit of imagination. It's personal, painful, and beautiful. Coleridge also tried his hand at drama. His play Remorse was performed at Drury Lane after being recommended by Byron. Again, that connection has been asked in exam. The play was a stage success but didn't make much literary impact. And that really is Coleridge's story, bursts of pure brilliance surrounded by long stretches of struggle. His life was a pattern of great beginnings and unfinished works. Addiction, indecision, and self-doubt kept him from completing what his imagination had already conceived. Yet, even in fragments in Kubla Khan, Christabel, the Ancient Mariner, his genius shines through. So, when you think of Coleridge, remember this. His creativity was brief but timeless. His imagination built dreamscapes no one else could match. And though much of his life was clouded by pain, his best poetry remains luminous, mystical, and utterly unique, which is exactly why he's still a favorite in every exam. Now, Coleridge wasn't just a poet, he was also a thinker and lecturer. His range is honestly mind-blowing. Some of his key works include The Watchman, published in 1790, which was his short-lived political journal. That title has been asked in exam. Then there's The Friend, published in 1809, a collection of essays and reflections on philosophy and society, and yes, that one too appears in exam lists. He also gave a series of lectures on politics and religion in 1795, and later a huge set of lectures on literature between 1808 and 1819. His Table Talk, published posthumously, is full of his casual yet brilliant reflections, and that's another one worth remembering for exam. But his best-known prose work is Biographia Literaria, published in 1813 in 2 volumes. This is a must-know. It's part autobiography, part literary theory, and it lays out his ideas about imagination, the primary and secondary imagination ideas that completely reshaped literary criticism. Examiners love this one. Coleridge also wrote on the Constitution of the Church and State. That title, too, has been asked in exam along with Aids to Reflection and Lay Sermons. And don't forget his early play Osorio, written in 1797. Later he reworked it as Remorse, which became a hit on the London stage. Now, let's talk poetry, because this is where students get the most exam questions. Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is one of the cornerstones of Romantic poetry. It appeared in Lyrical Ballads and tells the eerie story of a sailor cursed after killing an albatross. Then comes Kubla Khan, the poem he claimed to have written in an opium-induced dream, the one that begins, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree." This poem's dreamlike imagery and fragmentary form have been discussed endlessly in exams. Christabel is another major poem with its Gothic atmosphere and mysterious characters. Frost at Midnight gives us a more personal and meditative side of Coleridge, celebrating nature and childhood. And Dejection, an ode, reveals his inner struggles, turning personal despair into philosophical reflection. Every one of these poems, Christabel, Frost at Midnight, Kubla Khan, Dejection, an ode, and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, has been asked in exam at least once. 2. So if you want to remember Coleridge easily, his prose shows his mind, his poetry shows his imagination, and together they make him one of the deepest voices of Romanticism. From ghost ships and pleasure domes to philosophical meditations on the imagination, Coleridge's work bridges dream and reason, poetry and philosophy. All right, let's sail straight into one of the most haunting poems in English literature, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This is Coleridge's longest poem, written around 1797 and 98, and first published in Lyrical Ballads in 1798, that same collection which marked the start of British Romantic literature. Yes, this connection has been asked in exam. The poem begins with a scene almost everyone remembers. 3 men are on their way to a wedding, and suddenly one of them is stopped by a mysterious old sailor, the Ancient Mariner. That opening image, the mariner detaining the wedding guest, has been directly tested in exam. The guest tries to resist, but the mariner's glittering eye holds him spellbound. The guest's mood shifts from irritation to fascination as the strange tale unfolds. The mariner tells how his ship once set sail from his home port, gliding into calm seas until a huge storm drove them south into icy waters. There, surrounded by mist and snow, they meet an albatross, a great sea bird that seems to bring good luck. The sailors greet it as a good omen, until the mariner, for reasons he never explains, shoots the bird with his crossbow. This shocking act, the killing of the albatross, has been asked in exam again and again because it sets off the poem's entire chain of guilt and punishment. At first, the sailors curse him for killing the bird of good fortune. But when the fog lifts, they change their minds and praise him only to be punished themselves. The ship becomes stranded in a still, silent sea, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. That line, of course, is another exam favorite. Water surrounds them, but none they can drink. Their throats are parched, and they begin to see eerie lights and death fires dancing on the water. Then comes one of the poem's most chilling moments. A ghostly ship glides toward them, carrying two figures, Death and a woman called Life and Death. They gamble with dice for the souls of the crew. Death wins the sailors, Life in Death wins the mariner. From that moment, his punishment begins. Every sailor drops dead before him, each cursing him with his eye, leaving him alone with their corpses and the slimy sea. Unable to pray, he feels a wicked whisper restraining his soul. This moment of spiritual paralysis has been tested in exam. For 7 days and nights he suffers, surrounded by the dead. Then something miraculous happens. By moonlight, he notices water snakes moving gracefully in the sea, and for the first time he feels love for these creatures. Spontaneously, he blesses them, and at that moment, the albatross falls from his neck into the water. That symbolic moment of redemption, also a key exam point, marks the lifting of his curse. Spirits then possess the dead sailors and make them work the ship, guiding it home. Two mysterious voices discuss the mariner's fate, deciding he must wander the earth, retelling his story as penance. The ship finally reaches home, but as a pilot, a hermit, and a boy row out to meet it, the vessel suddenly sinks. The mariner is rescued and confesses his sin to the hermit, who becomes his spiritual guide. The story ends with the wedding guest changed forever. He wakes from the tale a sadder and a wiser man. This closing line, too, often appears in exam questions. Now, thematically, the poem weaves together sin, guilt, punishment, and redemption. The albatross becomes a symbol of nature, and by killing it, the mariner breaks harmony with the natural world. Only when he learns to bless even the slimy things of the sea does he find peace again. Coleridge blends supernatural elements, ghost ships, spirits, and curses with deep moral lessons about love, repentance, and reverence for life. Stylistically, the poem reads like a traditional ballad, using simple language and repetition for rhythm and drama. Later, in 1817, Coleridge revised it and added a prose gloss in the margins to explain the story, another small fact examiners love to test. By the end, we're left with a sense of mystery and wonder, the feeling that nature is vast, alive, and full of spiritual meaning. The rhyme of the ancient mariner is not just a sea voyage, it's a voyage of the soul, from guilt to grace. If you remember even half these lines, you'll ace any question that comes up. The poem opens as the mariner stops a wedding guest to tell his strange, unforgettable tale. At first, the voyage seems peaceful. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. These lines, which have been asked in exam, set the stage beautifully. Everything feels calm until it isn't. Soon the ship is trapped. Day after day, day after day, we stuck. Nor breath nor motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. This image of a motionless ship on a lifeless sea has been directly tested in exam, and it perfectly captures that eerie stillness. Coleridge does so well. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The mariner confesses, "With my crossbow I shot the albatross." The simple act, killing the bird of good omen, brings a curse upon the ship. The albatross becomes a symbol of guilt and sin. Later, the line, "The albatross about my neck was hung," shows how that guilt turns into a physical burden. Both of these lines have been asked in exam. Now, the irony of their punishment couldn't be sharper. Surrounded by endless ocean, the sailors are dying of thirst. Water, water, everywhere, nor any drop to drink. You can almost feel the cruel twist of fate here, and yes, This is one of the most quoted lines in all of English poetry, often asked in exam. The mariner is left utterly alone. Coleridge repeats the word to make us feel his isolation. Alone, alone, all alone. Alone on a wide, wide sea. That repetition is pure genius. It makes you feel the emptiness, the echoing silence around him. Another key line to remember for exam. Even as he's surrounded by death and strange, slimy things creeping across the water, the mariner keeps living, and 1,000 slimy things lived on. And so did I. That line captures his torment. He's alive, but spiritually dead. And then something changes. The mariner looks at the sea creatures again, and instead of hating them, he blesses them unconsciously, and in that moment, he can finally pray. The self-same moment I could pray, and from my neck so free, the albatross fell off and sank like lead into the sea. That's the turning point, the moment of grace and release from guilt. Coleridge then delivers the poem's moral in the simplest, most memorable lines. He prayeth best, who loveth best all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. This one has been asked again and again in exam because it sums up the entire poem, love and respect for all creation, bring peace to the soul. Finally, the story ends with the wedding guest who's been listening in horror and awe. The last lines say, a sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. It's such a quiet, beautiful ending showing how the mariner's tale has changed not only him but also the listener. So if you want to remember this poem for exam, think of it as a journey from sin to suffering, from guilt to grace. The killing of the albatross starts it, the blessing of the sea creatures redeems it, and that moral loving all of God's creations ties it together. Alright, let's talk about Kubla Khan, one of the most mysterious and magical poems in English literature, and yes, one that's been asked many times in exam. Coleridge wrote Kubla Khan in 1797, but it wasn't published until 1816. The story behind it is almost as famous as the poem itself. Coleridge said he composed it after taking laudanum, that's an opium mixture, and claimed the whole vision came to him in an opium-induced dream. He said he saw the entire poem, around 200 to 300 lines long, but just as he began writing, he was interrupted by, in his words, a person from Porlock. And that interruption, he said, made him forget the rest of the vision. This person from Porlock story has been directly asked in exam, so mark it down. For years, Coleridge kept the poem private, thinking it was incomplete. But Lord Byron encouraged him to finally publish it in 1816, another key exam point. At the time, his contemporaries didn't quite know what to make of it. Some doubted his dream story entirely, calling it a convenient myth. But later generations came to see Kubla Khan as one of the finest examples of romantic poetry, a poem about imagination itself. Now let's step into the poem. The first stanza describes Xanadu, the pleasure dome of the Mongol emperor Kubla Khan. You'll often see this in exam questions. Coleridge describes Alph, the sacred river, winding through caverns measureless to man down to a sunless sea. That river, Alph, has been specifically asked in exam. The stanza paints a world that's both real and dreamlike. Gardens, forests, winding streams, and walls enclosing 10 miles of fertile land. It's Coleridge's idea of human art shaping nature. The second stanza shifts in tone. We see a deep, haunted chasm, a savage place, from which a fountain bursts violently, feeding the sacred river. Here, the imagery grows darker and wilder, suggesting the raw, creative energy of nature. During this eruption, Kubla hears ancestral voices prophesying war. The pleasure dome, reflected in the waves below, becomes a symbol of harmony between chaos and order, creation and destruction balanced. These details about the river, the prophecy, and the reflection have all appeared in exam questions. Then comes the third stanza, and here's the twist. The poem's voice changes. Suddenly, we're no longer in Xanadu, we're in the poet's mind. The speaker recalls a vision of an Abyssinian maid playing a dulcimer and singing of Mount Abora. That Abyssinian maid and her music, another recurring exam question, represent pure, inspired imagination. The poet wishes he could recall her song, because to do so would let him rebuild the pleasure dome in his mind. But there's a catch. If he did, those who heard it would fall into a kind of divine trance, filled with awe and fear. They'd see the poet himself transformed, surrounded by warning voices, like a prophet or even a magician who has tasted the fruit of paradise. This final shift, where the poem becomes about poetic creation and the danger of imagination, is what gives Kubla Khan its strange power. Structurally, the poem has 3 irregular stanzas, moving between 3 kinds of space: the outer world of Xanadu, the inner world of nature's force, and finally the inner world of the imagination. Critics later admired the structure as a perfect symbol of how romantic poetry moves between dream and reality. And yes, today Kubla Khan stands alongside the Rime of the Ancient Mariner as one of Coleridge's masterpieces. You can even see the original manuscript at the British Library in London. So, to remember it for the exam: Dream Vision, written under laudanum, interrupted by the person from Porlock, Alf, the sacred river, and the pleasure dome in the first stanza, the eruption and prophecy of war in the second, the Abyssinian maid and the creative trance in the third. It's a poem about imagination, how fragile, beautiful, and dangerous it can be. You've probably heard that this poem came to Coleridge in an opium-induced dream, and whether that's legend or truth, it fits the mystical, hallucinatory feel of the poem perfectly. It begins with those famous lines, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree." This opening line, which has been asked in exam, instantly sets the tone. Over day, we're in a mythical kingdom called Xanadu, where Kubla Khan, a powerful ruler, commands that a magnificent pleasure dome be built. Then comes the description of the landscape, where Alf, the sacred river, ran through caverns, measureless to man down to a sunless sea. These lines, also frequently tested in exam, bring out the mystery, a sacred river disappearing into a dark, unknowable sea. Coleridge paints nature as something both beautiful and terrifying, filled with depth and power beyond human understanding. The poet then describes the size of this paradise. So, twice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers were girdled round. Imagine an immense walled garden, the perfect symbol of human order imposed on wild nature. Inside this enclosed world, Coleridge gives us gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. The air is rich with fragrance and life, but just as we are lulled by beauty, the mood changes. He calls it a savage place, as holy and enchanted as air beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. This image, and yes, it's been asked in exam, brings in both the sacred and the dangerous, showing how creativity and chaos are always intertwined. Then Coleridge turns to pure energy. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast, thick pans were breathing. The earth itself seems alive, restless, pulsing with creative force. You can almost feel the poem's heartbeat here. And then the unforgettable contrast. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. This has also appeared in exam. It's such a brilliant image, warmth and cold, light and darkness, heaven and hell, all coexisting in one vision. That's Coleridge's imagination at full stretch. In the closing vision, the speaker imagines others gazing in awe at a mysterious figure, and all who heard should see them there, and all should cry, "Beware, beware, beastie." His flashing eyes, his floating hair. The figure is wild, almost divine, someone who has touched the source of inspiration itself. And finally, the haunting last lines, "For he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise." This too has been asked in exam. It suggests the poet himself, someone who has tasted divine inspiration, but who can never fully explain or control it. So Kubla Khan isn't just about a pleasure dome or a mystical city. It's about the creative process itself, the tension between beauty and chaos, inspiration and loss. Coleridge captures what it feels like to dream, to create, and to wake up knowing the vision has vanished. Alright, let's talk about one of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's most mysterious works, Christabel. This is a long narrative ballad. And yes, that phrase has been asked in exam. Coleridge began writing it in 1797 and added a second part in 1800. He originally planned 3 more parts, but he never finished them. That incompletion became one of his lifelong regrets. He often said Christabel was the poem that made him doubt his own poetic power. Now, interestingly, Christabel wasn't included in lyrical ballads. Wordsworth advised against it, feeling it didn't fit the collection's tone. Later, in 1816, Coleridge finally published it together with Kubla Khan and The Pains of Sleep, and yes, that combination has been directly asked in exam. The poem uses a flexible accentual meter, 4 stresses or accents per line, which gives it a haunting rhythm. The story itself begins when Christabel, a young, noble woman, ventures into the forest at night and meets a strange, helpless woman named Geraldine. Geraldine claims she has been kidnapped by rough men. Moved by pity, Christabel takes her home, and that moment changes everything. Once they are back at the castle, supernatural hints start to appear. The dog howls, the fire flickers, the kind of eerie foreshadowing Coleridge was so good at. When the 2 women go to rest, Geraldine reveals a mysterious mark on her body, though Coleridge never describes it directly. Whatever it is, it's terrifying. Soon, Christabel's father, Sir Leoline, becomes enchanted by Geraldine's story and orders a grand procession to celebrate her rescue. But the reader knows something is wrong. Christabel, under a spell, begins to sense Geraldine's dark nature even as her father remains blind to it. The poem ends abruptly, unfinished, with Christabel's growing fear, and that incomplete ending has itself been discussed in exam. Now let's shift to Coleridge's dramatic work, Osorio, later renamed Remorse. Osorio was written in 1797, around the same time as Christabel. It's a tragedy in blank verse, and that's been asked in exam, but when Coleridge submitted it to Drury Lane Theatre, it was rejected. 16 years later, in 1813, he reworked the play and retitled it Remorse. This version finally found success. It was performed at Drury Lane, ran for 20 nights, and was printed 3 times that same year. Remorse became one of Coleridge's few theatrical triumphs, showing how revision and persistence can turn failure into success. So, to sum up, Christabel is Coleridge's haunting, unfinished tale of innocence and enchantment, first written in 1797, published in 1816, while Osorio, later Remorse, shows him mastering blank verse drama and finally winning public acclaim. Together, they show both sides of Coleridge, the dream-like storyteller and the serious dramatist.